You cannot pass, Colonel.
I have authorization. Move aside, officer.
My orders say otherwise.
You are obstructing a police investigation, Colonel. I advise you to cooperate.
And I advise you to respect this uniform, officer.
I have my orders.
The sidewalk. She kept her gaze forward, mind rehearsing the day's briefings, when the screech of brakes split the calm. A police cruiser skidded to a halt beside her. Officer Garrett, mid-40s, his face tight with irritation, leaned out of the driver's window. "Hey, lady," he barked, eyes narrowing. "You got a permit for those boots?" Aisha froze, pulse spiking. The street felt smaller, the pedestrians silent witnesses. She began, but Garrett interrupted, his tone sharp, condescending. "Don't talk back. Step aside. I need to check your ID." The hand that rested on his holster was not gentle. She clenched her briefcase, the leather trembling under her grip, and met his gaze. There was no respect there, only suspicion and disdain. "Are you serious?" Aisha's voice, steady but low, cut through the hum of the city. "I'm a commissioned officer in the United States Army." Garrett smirked, shaking his head, his laugh bitter and public. "Yeah, right. Army or not, you're still breaking law." The crowd shifted, phones emerging like tiny suns. Aisha's stomach dropped as he stepped forward, handcuffs glinting under the sun. She realized then authority could be weaponized, and today it had chosen her. The morning was sharp with light, the air filled with the metallic hum of the city. Colonel Aisha Thompson walked in perfect cadence, her boots tapping like measured drumbeats on the concrete. The uniform she wore was not just fabric, it was authority, discipline, and decades of service. Yet, as she approached the recruitment office, a sudden screech of brakes shattered the morning's rhythm. A cruiser slid beside her, dust kicking up in its wake. Officer Garrett leaned out of the window, his gaze fixed on her boots, narrowing like a predator assessing prey. "Hey, lady," he said, voice clipped. "You got a permit for those boots?" Aisha halted. "I'm a commissioned officer," she said, calm, measured. "This is my uniform." Garrett's smirk was dismissive. "Yeah, right. Step aside. I need to check your ID." Hand hovering near his holster, he radiated authority. Aisha clutched her briefcase tighter. Her pulse quickened, not with fear of the unknown, but with the certainty of being seen through a lens of prejudice. Pedestrians slowed, eyes shifting, whispers curling like smoke. "I'm not stepping aside," she said. "I've done nothing wrong." "You think that matters?" Garrett leaned closer, public and aggressive. "I decide what's wrong here." By the time he reached the handcuffs, the street had turned into a courtroom of silence, witnesses armed with phones and idle curiosity. Aisha felt the cold bite of metal around her wrists, the weight of injustice pressing down with every click of the cuffs. "You're making a mistake," she said. Her voice was steady, low, an anchor in a storm of disbelief. "Army or not, you're under arrest," he said. The cruiser's engine roared, swallowing the murmurs of the crowd. Aisha glanced at the faces pressed against the glass, strangers frozen mid-step. Authority had chosen to weaponize itself, and today it had chosen her. As the doors closed, the city swallowed her whole. The officer's smirk lingered in her mind, a shadow over every heartbeat. She realized then that one day this moment would not stand alone, but for now it stood, unresolved and heavy, the first note in a song of injustice. The precinct smelled of disinfectant and old coffee, a sterile haze that did little to mask the tension simmering beneath the fluorescent lights. Aisha Thompson was led down a narrow corridor, the metallic clang of her cuffs echoing against the walls. Every step made her stomach tighten, every turn a reminder that she had been reduced to a suspect in a system she had sworn to protect. Officer Garrett walked beside her, his uniform crisp, but his demeanor heavy with judgment. "Sit there," he ordered, pointing to a cold metal chair in the processing area. His voice had the brittle edge of someone accustomed to compliance, yet unprepared for defiance. Aisha lowered herself onto the chair, maintaining the posture drilled into her through years of military protocol. Her mind catalogued the surroundings, the buzzing overhead lights, the faint hum of conversation behind barred windows, the monotone voice of dispatcher over the radio. Each detail was a thread in the tapestry of institutional power designed to intimidate, to make the accused feel small. Name, rank, and reason for being here. Garrett barked, scribbling on a clipboard as if the paper itself could validate his authority. Colonel Aisha Thompson, she said, her voice measured. United States Army. I am here because you stopped me without cause. Garrett's pen paused. His smirk returned. Army, huh? Doesn't exempt you from the law. You know the drill. You've misused your authority, she countered, her tone low but firm. You assume guilt based on appearance. The processing officer glanced up from the counter, indifferent. All officers get complaints. You want to fill out a grievance. We'll take it. But first, follow procedure. Aisha watched as Garrett waved toward a fingerprint scanner. She placed her fingers on the glass, the device whirring beneath her touch. Each beat felt like a judgment, each flash of light a reminder of the systemic machinery that could, with a single decision, redefine her reality. You think you're tough. Garrett leaned closer, lowering his voice. You're just another civilian now. No uniform, no rank, no respect. Aisha's chest tightened, but she refused to let anger dictate her actions. Respect is earned, not assumed by fear, she said, eyes locking with his. Your prejudice does not define me. Garrett snorted and moved away, muttering under his breath, leaving her to the silent hum of the precinct. Officers passed by, indifferent or distracted, some glancing at her cuffs but not offering assistance. The bureaucratic indifference was as sharp as any insult, a reminder that power could be exercised through omission as easily as through action. A clerk called her name, directing her toward a small interview room. She walked in, noticing the stark, blank walls, the single table, and the 2 chairs. Garrett followed, placing a file on the table with a thud that echoed like a gavel. Tell me exactly what happened, he demanded. Aisha leaned forward, hands still cuffed, and began recounting the morning, the street confrontation, the public humiliation. Every word was precise, every detail documented. The dialogue was not just information, it was resistance. She refused to let her narrative be rewritten. You think this makes a difference? Garrett asked, leaning back, arms crossed. Nobody cares about your excuses. You're lucky I'm even giving you the courtesy of a report. You're lucky I haven't called my chain of command, Aisha replied evenly. Because if you think I'm alone here, you're mistaken. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to slice with a knife. Garrett's smirk wavered for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Aisha to recognize the power of presence, of unwavering composure in the face of bias. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The officers outside whispered in muted tones, some curious, others indifferent. The precinct was a microcosm of a larger societal pattern, authority unchecked, assumptions unchallenged, and those who dared to resist made to feel inconsequential. Finally, Garrett stood. We'll sort this out, he said, but the words carried no real assurance. Aisha was led back to the holding area, the cuffs still biting into her wrists, the fluorescent lights bleaching every color from the room. She noted the subtle looks of disapproval, the half-hearted glances of bystanders, and realized that this was not just about her mourning. This was a display of systemic power in motion. She settled on a bench, the metal cold beneath her, breathing steadily. The injustice of the morning had not been resolved. It had been magnified. Yet, as the minutes passed, a quiet determination took root. Every slight, every dismissive glance, every assumption of guilt only strengthened her resolve. The precinct was a crucible, and she would endure it. The clock ticked on, each second a drumbeat toward confrontation, resistance, and the inevitable reckoning. She knew the fight had just begun. Aisha Thompson sat in the small, gray interview room of the precinct, her hands still cuffed, fingers drumming lightly against the cold metal of the table. Her mind was a careful ledger of events, each detail recorded with precision, each microaggression catalogued for later scrutiny. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, a reminder that the city operated on routine and procedure, even when that procedure was wielded against justice. Colonel Thompson. A voice broke the hum. It was Lieutenant Ramirez, a liaison officer from Internal Affairs, clipboard in hand. We're waiting for your legal representation. Yes, Aisha replied, her voice steady, though the tension in her jaw was palpable. My attorney will be here shortly. Until then, I will answer only procedural questions. Garrett leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a smug expression that suggested he believed the battle was already won. You think lawyers will save you, he said, tone dripping with condescension. You're here because you provoked me. Appearances matter. Aisha met his gaze. Prejudice matters more than appearances in your world, apparently. You've judged me before even asking questions. Minutes passed. Then, finally, her phone buzzed on the table. Her lawyer had arrived. The lawyer, Marcus Bennett, mid-40s, experienced and calm, greeted her with a firm nod, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Colonel Thompson, he said, scanning the file Garrett had carelessly dropped. This is serious. They are treating you like any civilian, but I see how bias is influencing every step of this process. You need to remain precise, concise, and unwavering. I intend to, Aisha said. Bennett began laying out the steps. We'll request full incident reports, body cam footage, witness statements. They'll try to obscure or delay access. Every hesitation, every bureaucratic brush-off is evidence of systemic discrimination. We document meticulously. Garrett scoffed, muttering under his breath. You think paperwork will undo this? It will, Bennett said without hesitation, because when it's documented, nothing hides. Not your bias, not your assumptions. And Colonel Thompson, he added, leaning closer, your rank matters. It's not just a title. It carries authority and credibility. Don't let him undermine that. The conversation shifted to strategy. Dialogue flowed rapidly, discussing motions, formal complaints, and the chain of command. Aisha listened intently, the cadence of the discussion grounding her. Each word, each calculated step, was a countermeasure against the arbitrary power wielded by Garrett. Internal affairs is cautious, Bennett said. They will investigate, but slowly. This isn't a sprint. It's a marathon of accountability. And the public? Aisha asked, a slight tension in her voice. What role does perception play? Bennett's eyes hardened. Public scrutiny can be a double-edged sword. It pressures a department to act, but also exposes you to unwanted attention. We must balance transparency with control over narrative. Every interview, every statement, must be deliberate. Garrett's impatience was visible. He muttered something about wasting time, about orders and discipline. Aisha ignored him, focusing on the legal framework taking shape around her. Dialogue between her and Bennett carved a path through the bureaucracy, revealing the structural weaknesses and the subtle, coded biases embedded in procedure. Remember, Bennett added, your calm is your power. The system is uncomfortable when you refuse to comply with fear or intimidation. They expect confusion, anger, or submission. You provide none. You provide clarity. As the minutes passed, the precinct transformed from a space of entrapment into a chessboard. Every move was calculated. Every word spoken or withheld was a piece in a larger strategy. Aisha's mind worked in tandem with Bennett's, constructing a narrative that could survive scrutiny, dismantle bias, and reveal injustice. Garrett, increasingly agitated, attempted to interject, his authority challenged by the very law he had assumed would bend to his will. Aisha responded with calm precision, asserting facts, dates, and timelines, refusing to be intimidated. Dialogue became the battleground, words sharper than any handcuff. By the time Bennett concluded, the legal groundwork was laid. Requests had been filed, motions drafted, and witnesses identified. Aisha allowed herself a brief moment of quiet resolve, understanding that this fight extended far beyond the precinct walls, far beyond a confrontation with Garrett. She had entered the legal maze as a target, but with knowledge, precision, and unyielding composure, she was already navigating its corridors. Every bureaucratic delay, every procedural obstacle was a test of patience and endurance. She would endure, she would document, and she would ensure that prejudice could not hide behind procedure. The precinct clock ticked relentlessly. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet rebellion forming within its walls. Aisha Thompson's fight had only begun, but each measured dialogue, each deliberate action, was a step toward accountability, toward exposing the fragile, biased machinery of authority. By mid-afternoon, the story of Aisha Thompson's arrest had begun to ripple through the city. Word traveled in hushed tones among colleagues, whispered phone calls, and the occasional headline glimpsed on a scrolling news feed. The narrative, already distorted, presented her as a civilian in trouble with the law, a simplification that stripped context and authority from her identity. Aisha sat in a quiet corner of the precinct interview room, her uniform now rumpled from the morning's confrontation. Her hands were free, but the weight of scrutiny pressed on her shoulders. She listened as Bennett explained the implications of public perception. "They are framing this as an isolated incident," he said, tapping the open laptop in front of him. "The department will deny systemic bias, the media will sensationalize, and the public will react without understanding the full story. We need to control what information is released." Aisha nodded, her jaw tight. "So the real battle is outside these walls, in whispers and headlines." "Yes," Bennett replied. "Your reputation is both weapon and shield. You need allies and witnesses. Every colleague, every civilian who saw what happened, they matter." Meanwhile, Garrett patrolled the precinct hallways, smirking at those who asked questions. His casual remark to other officers, "She thinks she's untouchable or army or not. She learned a lesson," were subtle injections of bias shaping perception in small, persistent ways. These comments circulated like gossip, feeding assumptions and reinforcing hierarchies. By late afternoon, Aisha's phone buzzed. Messages from colleagues flooded in, expressions of support, veiled warnings, and questions about her condition. Some had been present during the street incident, witnessing the escalation firsthand. Others had only heard fragments, filtered through the lens of the department's narrative. She opened a message from Captain Reynolds, her superior in the Army, who had been informed of the situation. "We've got your back. Document everything. Trust your chain of command. The department may be slow, but we will act." The words offered some reassurance, yet the gap between support and public perception remained stark. Aisha felt the emotional strain of seeing her professional identity questioned in real time. She had trained for combat, for strategy, for leadership, but the battlefield of rumor and reputation was entirely different. Dialogue with her peers reinforced the stakes. Subtle microaggressions, dismissive laughter, and whispered skepticism painted a picture of society still uncomfortable with authority when embodied by someone like her. Later, a reporter's voice rang from a phone call. "Colonel Thompson, can you comment on the arrest?" Aisha's fingers hovered over the receiver, aware that a single misstep could be amplified. "I'm working with my legal counsel," she said finally, her tone firm, deliberate. "I cannot comment on an ongoing investigation." The silence that followed was telling. Behind it was the weight of expectation, the pressure of public attention, and the tension of knowing that perception was a form of power. Every overheard remark in the precinct, every passing glance, became a study in coded language, the subtle ways authority communicated assumptions and biases without ever speaking them outright. Bennett guided her through managing these interactions. Keep responses short, factual, and consistent. They'll try to provoke emotion because they can't challenge facts. Your calm undermines their narrative. Aisha repeated the line in her head like a mantra. She felt a growing sense of resilience, tempered by the frustration of witnessing systemic inertia. In the conversations around her, both in person and over the phone, she detected the patterns: hesitation, disbelief, half-truths, and implicit assumptions that perpetuated injustice. By evening, she was allowed a brief reprieve. Sitting alone in her barracks room, she reflected on the day's events. Every whisper, every rumor, every misrepresentation of her arrest had its effect, slowing justice, obscuring truth, and testing her resolve. Dialogue with allies, both military and civilian, became lifelines, reaffirming that resistance was not solitary but collaborative. Even as the city continued unaware, Aisha realized that perception was a battleground equal in importance to legality. To reclaim control, she would have to navigate not only the procedural maze but the court of public opinion, using strategy, evidence, and patience to counter the tide of assumptions. The night deepened, the city's lights casting long shadows across streets she had walked confidently that morning. Rumors lingered, reputations teetered, and the machinery of bias continued its silent, grinding motion. Aisha understood that her fight extended far beyond the precinct walls. Every whispered doubt and every questioning glance was an extension of the arrest itself, a reminder that justice required vigilance, courage, and a relentless assertion of truth. The day ended without resolution, but the seeds of strategy and resilience were firmly planted. Aisha's reputation, under assault, would survive if carefully guarded, meticulously documented, and relentlessly defended. The interview room was colder than the city streets had been that morning, the fluorescent lights casting stark, unforgiving shadows. Aisha Thompson had requested a formal meeting with Officer Garrett under the supervision of Internal Affairs. She entered with measured steps, her boots echoing against the tile floor, a cadence of authority that contrasted sharply with the tension vibrating in the room. Garrett was already there, leaning against the table with arms crossed, the smugness from earlier in the day etched deep into his features. His eyes flicked over her uniform, lingering as if expecting hesitation, submission, or perhaps even fear. He found none. "Colonel Thompson," he said, voice casual, but his tone carried an undercurrent of challenge. "I didn't think you'd actually request this. Thought you'd crawl back to your lawyer and stay quiet." Aisha didn't flinch. "I'm not here for courtesy, Garrett. I'm here to set the record straight, to ensure facts are documented accurately." His smirk widened. "Facts? You mean your version of the story?" "Yes," she replied. "And evidence. Witnesses. Body cam footage. Reports. All of it. Nothing subjective. Nothing assumed." The tension in the room thickened, and Garrett shifted slightly, as though adjusting to a confrontation he had not anticipated. "You really think all that paperwork will matter? You're just a civilian in my jurisdiction now. Rank doesn't change that." "I am not a civilian," she said, voice steady, controlled, carrying the weight of her commission. "And authority is not defined by fear, nor by assumptions. Your bias does not supersede law or duty." Internal Affairs Officer Ramirez observed silently from the corner, clipboard in hand. The room became a stage for dialogue that cut sharper than any weapon. Each line exchange revealed the power dynamics at play. One wielded authority recklessly, assuming prejudice was invisible. The other claimed it with calm precision, refusing to be intimidated. Garrett leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You think you're untouchable because of your uniform, because you wear stars on your shoulders. I think I'm untouchable because I know the law, because I know procedure, and because I document injustice meticulously," Aisha replied. "You, on the other hand, operate on assumptions and fear. That is not authority. That is abuse." The words landed like blows, not physical but far heavier. Garrett's expression faltered for the briefest instant, revealing the first crack in facade of control he had maintained since the morning. But the moment passed. He adjusted his stance, masking vulnerability with irritation. "You think I don't see the way people are whispering about you?" he asked. "Even here, in my department, you're already causing trouble. This could have been handled quietly, but you escalate." Aisha's eyes narrowed. "What you see as trouble is accountability, and what you call escalation is refusing to accept prejudice as fact. You are uncomfortable because you cannot dominate the narrative with bias anymore." Garrett's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're a lot smarter than I gave you credit for." "Not smarter," she corrected. "Prepared, disciplined, and unwilling to let personal bias dictate justice. There's a difference." The conversation turned procedural. Dialogue shifted to timelines, statements, and internal reporting. Aisha methodically challenged every false assumption he had made, every procedural shortcut he had taken, every derogatory remark that implied her guilt before facts were confirmed. She cited regulations, chain of command protocols, and legal precedent, leaving no room for ambiguity. "You may think this is over," she said, leaning forward slightly, voice even but sharp. "But every action you've taken has consequences. Every assumption, every misuse of authority is now on record. I suggest you consider that carefully." Garrett's hand flexed on the table. "You don't scare me." "I'm not here to scare you," she replied. "I'm here to ensure accountability. You're responsible for your choices. Garrett, that is the only leverage that matters." The room was silent for a long moment. The dynamic had shifted. No longer was she a passive subject of bias. She was an active force, turning his assumptions into evidence, his arrogance into vulnerability. Internal Affairs Officer Ramirez nodded subtly, recognizing the clarity and control Aisha wielded over the exchange. Finally, Garrett straightened, pushing away from the table. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that hinted at frustration. "You're going to regret making this official," he muttered. Aisha gathered the documents, hands steady. "Regret will be yours if you continue to let prejudice override procedure," she said. As she walked toward the door, every step was deliberate, each click of her boots a rhythm of resolve. Outside the room, the precinct hummed with routine, oblivious to the quiet reckoning that had unfolded within its walls. Garrett was left staring, realizing for the first time that control could be challenged, not through force, but through steadfast adherence to truth and procedure. By the time she returned to her waiting area, the atmosphere had shifted. Allies and colleagues, observing from a distance, understood that a pivotal confrontation had taken place. Aisha's words, precise and unwavering, had not only exposed Garrett's bias, but had also set in motion the formal mechanisms that would demand accountability. For Aisha Thompson, this confrontation was not victory. It was a necessary assertion of justice, a step toward reclaiming authority stolen by prejudice. And as she prepared for the next stages of the legal and institutional struggle, she knew that the true battle was only beginning. The precinct had grown quiet by mid-morning, the low hum of activity replaced by the heavy tension that seemed to follow Aisha Thompson wherever she moved. Officer Garrett had returned from patrol, his presence a constant reminder of the biased authority she was up against. Today, however, the dynamic had shifted. He was aware that his actions were being scrutinized, and Aisha had begun to map the vulnerabilities in his control. "Colonel Thompson," Garrett called, voice intentionally loud to draw attention, "you're making this difficult. I suggest you reconsider how you're handling this situation." Aisha looked up from her notes, hands steady on the table. "I'm handling it according to law and procedure. Garrett, perhaps it's your actions that need reconsideration." He approached, leaning over the table, trying to impose dominance through proximity. "You think your rank changes anything here? You're just another civilian in my jurisdiction. I can make this uncomfortable for you." "You can try," she said, voice even, "but intimidation is not authority. It's a tactic, and I am prepared to document it." Garrett's jaw tightened, his smirk faltering for a moment before he masked it with a forced laugh. "You really believe documentation will protect you from the reality of power?" Aisha met his gaze without flinching. "Power without accountability is meaningless. Your bias is visible. Your abuse is recorded. That is reality, Garrett." The room seemed to shrink with tension. Every officer who passed by sensed the confrontation, though few intervened. Bystander silence was its own form of complicity, yet in Aisha's eyes, it also offered clarity. She could not rely on passive observation, only on deliberate action. "Do you really think anyone will believe you?" Garrett spat, voice rising, attempting to provoke fear or doubt. "They already have to," Aisha replied calmly, "because the evidence is indisputable. Witnesses, footage, procedural violations, all of it points to your misuse of authority. Belief is secondary. Accountability is primary." The words landed like measured blows. Garrett straightened, his hand brushing the file he had slammed down earlier, as though searching for some anchor in his unraveling control. Dialogue had become the battleground, and every sentence Aisha spoke chipped away at the illusion of dominance he had assumed. Internal Affairs Officer Ramirez, observing silently, made notes. Aisha's strategy was meticulous. She controlled the pace, emphasized facts, and refused to react emotionally. Garrett's attempt to provoke her, to destabilize her composure, failed repeatedly. "You've pushed too far," Garrett said, his voice low now, edged with frustration rather than authority. "Do you have any idea what you're inviting?" Aisha's eyes didn't waver. "I invite accountability. You, Garrett, are responsible for your actions. Every decision, every biased assumption, every misuse of power is on record. That is the only invitation I extend." The shift was subtle but undeniable. Other officers in the room glanced between them, sensing the reversal of power. The intimidation that had defined Garrett's morning now faltered under the weight of procedure, documentation, and unwavering composure. "You think this ends well for you," he muttered, stepping back. But every move you make has consequences. Yes, Aisha replied, and so do yours. The law is impartial, but it does not forgive negligence or prejudice. Minutes passed in tense silence. Garrett's agitation grew, the room vibrating with unspoken conflict. Every gesture, every glance, was amplified by the knowledge that this confrontation would not remain private. Documentation, witnesses, and legal oversight had transformed a personal dispute into an institutional reckoning. Finally, Garrett turned abruptly, muttering something under his breath, and left the room. The echo of his departure lingered, a hollow sound that underscored the shift in control. Aisha exhaled quietly, her mind cataloging the exchange. Dialogue had not only revealed bias, it had forced the abuser into a defensive posture, highlighting vulnerabilities that could be leveraged through formal channels. Bennett's earlier guidance resonated. Calm, precise, and deliberate engagement was more powerful than confrontation fueled by anger. Every microaggression, every attempt to intimidate, had been countered with methodical documentation and strategic assertion. Later, in a private review session with Ramirez and Bennett, Aisha went over the day's events. They discussed timelines, recorded statements, and the tactical importance of preserving each word spoken in this confrontation. Dialogue, they agreed, was both shield and sword, revealing prejudice while preventing escalation. By evening, Aisha sat alone in her barracks, reviewing her notes. The day had been exhausting, yet clarifying. She realized the stakes. Garrett was a symptom of a broader system of bias, but the day had proven that preparedness, documentation, and disciplined dialogue could expose weaknesses, even in entrenched authority. The breaking point had been reached, not with physical force, but with unflinching adherence to truth and procedure. The consequences were now inevitable. The machinery of justice, slow but relentless, was in motion. Aisha Thompson understood the cost of resistance, emotional fatigue, public scrutiny, and personal vulnerability. Yet she also understood the necessity. To challenge systemic injustice, one must endure discomfort, confront abuse, and maintain composure when authority assumes impunity. As night fell, the precinct quieted, shadows lengthening across the hallways. Garrett's actions had been catalogued, his bias exposed, and the wheels of accountability quietly set in motion. Aisha, though drained, felt a sense of resolve hardening within her, a recognition that the fight, though arduous, was guided by principle, procedure, and the unassailable power of truth. The news of Aisha Thompson's arrest had broken the precinct walls and spilled into the public sphere. Headline flashed across digital screens. Army colonel detained by city police, uniformed officer arrested. Case raises questions of bias. Social media buzzed with reactions, outrage, skepticism, and debate. The narrative was no longer contained. It had become a public reckoning. Aisha sat in a conference room in her barracks, Bennett beside her, laptop open to news feeds and public statements. The volume of attention was overwhelming, but the dialogue between them remained focused, deliberate, precise. "This is both opportunity and risk," Bennett said, fingers tapping the keyboard as he compiled statements. The public scrutiny forces transparency, but it also opens you to misrepresentation and attacks. Aisha leaned forward. "We control what we can: facts, evidence, witness statements. Everything else is noise. Our focus is accountability." Bennett nodded. "Exactly. Let the system handle the rest, but document every interaction. Every interview, every media inquiry, every public statement becomes part of the official record." Meanwhile, Officer Garrett had begun to sense the consequences of his actions. Rumors circulated among colleagues. Internal Affairs was reviewing not just his handling of Aisha's arrest, but patterns of prior complaints, inconsistencies in reports, and public exposure that had made oversight unavoidable. Dialogue among precinct officers grew cautious. Even allies of Garrett hesitated to defend him openly, aware that public scrutiny amplified risk. The first press conference was scheduled. Aisha, flanked by military representatives and her attorney, faced the cameras. Journalists pressed questions about her arrest, Garrett's conduct, and the department's response. Her answers were deliberate, calm, and factual. Each sentence reinforced her credibility. She recounted the street confrontation, the misuse of authority, and the bias evident in Garrett's assumptions. One reporter asked, Colonel Thompson, do you feel your rank influenced the outcome? Yes, she said evenly. Not because of privilege, but because authority, when documented and verified, cannot be ignored. The law is impartial, but it requires facts, evidence, and transparency to function properly. Another reporter questioned, why go public? Because silence allows abuse to continue unchecked, she replied. This isn't about individual revenge. It's about accountability, systemic integrity, and ensuring that authority is exercised fairly. Outside the room, Garrett had been called in by Internal Affairs. The dialogue was terse, procedural, and formal. He was questioned on prior complaints, his rationale for detaining Aisha, and the absence of mitigating evidence. Every inconsistency was noted, every condescending remark recorded. He realized, as the interview proceeded, that the informal power he had wielded on the street was now irrelevant. Documentation, witness statements, and public attention had transformed perception into accountability. Back in the conference room, Aisha's colleague spoke on her behalf, affirming her professionalism and the improbability of misconduct. Civilian witnesses who had been hesitant to come forward initially now offered statements. Their dialogue, carefully recorded, corroborated her account, providing a clear pattern of bias and abuse. Social media, though chaotic, had begun to reflect the truth. Videos from bystanders captured Garrett's behavior, evidence of his public smirk and condescending tone. The public discourse shifted, moving from speculation to acknowledgement of systemic patterns. Dialogue in comment sections, news panels, and internal discussions increasingly questioned the department's previous record, the adequacy of oversight, and the culture that allowed such arrests to occur. By evening, the precinct atmosphere had shifted palpably. Officers previously casual in their interactions with Garrett now tread lightly. Internal memos circulated, emphasizing procedure and fairness, cautioning against assumptions, and highlighting accountability measures. The system, slow but methodical, had begun to correct course. Aisha sat alone later that night, reviewing transcripts and news coverage. She noted the emotional fatigue, the subtle anxiety that public attention brought, but also the undeniable shift. The narrative had been reclaimed. Dialogue, documentation, and strategic transparency had transformed a personal confrontation into a public reckoning that could not be ignored. She reflected on the layers of systemic bias revealed, the microaggressions, the bureaucratic indifference, and the assumptions based on race and uniform. Each had been exposed, each challenged. Garrett, once confident in unchecked authority, now faced the tangible consequences of his actions. The night was quiet, yet charged with a sense of a turning point. The public, the media, and institutional oversight had intersected to create accountability. The consequences for Garrett were no longer speculative. They were imminent, formal, and visible. Aisha understood that victory was partial. Emotional costs, scrutiny, and the weight of public attention were real burdens. But the machinery of justice, bolstered by documentation, evidence, and deliberate dialogue, had begun to operate effectively. The abuser was exposed. The system, flawed but functional, was asserting correction. As she prepared to leave the barracks, Aisha felt the residual tension of the confrontation. Garrett's downfall was no longer theoretical. It was in motion, unstoppable now that visibility and accountability had converged. The public reckoning had begun, and with it, the path toward justice, systemic awareness, and eventual resolution. The disciplinary hearing was set in a stark conference room at the precinct headquarters. Officers, legal representatives, and internal affairs personnel filled the space, each position deliberately assigned to ensure formality and oversight. Aisha Thompson entered, uniform pressed, bearing the calm authority of someone who had spent her career navigating hierarchy, procedure, and conflict. Officer Garrett was already seated, shifting in his chair, attempting to appear composed. His confidence from the street had eroded under layers of documentation, witness statements, and public scrutiny. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as the room itself seemed to enforce impartiality through its sterile lighting and precise arrangement. Lieutenant Ramirez opened the session. This hearing addresses complaints against Officer Garrett regarding the arrest and treatment of Colonel Aisha Thompson. All evidence, statements, and documentation submitted by Internal Affairs will be reviewed. Garrett leaned back, a defensive posture. I follow procedure, he said, Voice strained. I acted according to policy. I don't see the issue. Aisha's eyes met his calmly. She had prepared meticulously. Policy exists to ensure fairness, not to mask prejudice. Assumptions based on appearance, race, or uniform are violations of both law and procedure. Your actions were neither impartial nor justified. Internal Affairs presented compiled evidence, body cam footage, transcript of dialogue, witness statements, and prior complaints documenting patterns of misconduct. Each piece demonstrated escalation, bias, and misuse of authority. Dialogue from Garrett's own statements contradicted his claims of procedural compliance, revealing condescension, intimidation, and selective enforcement of rules. The hearing officers questioned Garrett, referencing timestamps, footage, and testimony. Every attempt to deflect responsibility was countered by the clear record. Aisha's presence, calm and composed, amplified the credibility of the evidence. Her concise responses and unwavering demeanor reinforced the weight of facts over opinion. You may argue procedure, one officer said, but your tone, assumptions, and public behavior reflect misuse of discretion. How do you justify those choices? Garrett faltered, voice tight. I didn't mean to. You did mean to. Aisha interjected, measured. Every choice was intentional. The bias was not incidental. It was consistent, observable, and documented. Accountability is not punitive. It is corrective. Your actions threaten both the individual and the integrity of the institution. The officers deliberated, cross-referencing internal policies, federal guidelines, and the documented pattern of misconduct. Their dialogue was formal, precise, and structured to leave no room for personal interpretation or emotion, an environment where bias could not hide behind casual dismissal. Finally, the lead officer addressed Garrett. Based on evidence, witness testimony, and pattern of behavior, disciplinary measures will be enacted. Your actions violated departmental policy, abused authority, and caused reputational and emotional harm. You will be suspended without pay for 30 days, undergo retraining, and remain under probation for 1 year. Further violations will result in termination. Garrett's face paled. The certainty of formal consequences replaced the false confidence he had displayed since the street confrontation. Dialogue became minimal. The room absorbed the weight of institutional judgment, its mechanisms functioning as intended. Aisha remained composed, though internally tension lingered. Accountability had been achieved formally, but the emotional cost was not insignificant. She had endured humiliation, public scrutiny, and the psychological strain of confronting bias at multiple levels. Yet, the integrity of procedure, combined with persistence and meticulous documentation, had restored a measure of justice. Outside the hearing room, reporters captured the formal statements, colleagues expressed support, and the public became aware that institutional systems, though slow and imperfect, could produce accountability when evidence was indisputable and advocacy unwavering. Later, in a debrief with Bennett and her military superiors, Aisha reflected on the process. Dialogue among legal counsel, internal affairs, and the chain of command highlighted systemic lessons. Patterns of bias could be challenged, authority could be held accountable, and visibility was a critical tool in ensuring corrective action. Bennett remarked, "You've set a precedent. This case shows that persistence, evidence, and strategic engagement can overcome entrenched prejudice." The process was slow, but effective. Aisha nodded. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about exposing the system, the shadows that allow bias to persist. Today, Garrett faces consequences, but the work continues to ensure the institution acts fairly in the future. By evening, the city outside had resumed its rhythm, yet inside the precinct, the outcome resonated. Patterns of misconduct had been disrupted, bias exposed, and authority reasserted through proper channels. Aisha understood that accountability was never instantaneous, but with diligence, the machinery of justice could operate effectively. The day concluded with a tempered sense of resolution. Garrett would face formal consequences, and a precedent for scrutiny and transparency was established. Yet, Aisha recognized that the personal and emotional scars of confrontation remained, a reminder that systemic injustice left marks even when corrected. Her resolve, however, remained unshaken. Procedure, evidence, and principled dialogue had prevailed. Authority had been challenged, bias confronted, and accountability enforced. The battle was won formally, though vigilance would remain essential. The following morning, Aisha Thompson entered the precinct with a purpose sharper than any anxiety. The encounter with Garrett had left its mark, but she understood that one confrontation, one conversation, did not dismantle a system built over decades. Internal Affairs had agreed to oversee the next phase, but bureaucracy moved like molasses, slow, methodical, and often blind to injustice until pressure forced recognition. Lieutenant Ramirez greeted her with a nod, his clipboard already brimming with notes. "We'll begin by reviewing departmental policies and prior complaints," he said. "Your case isn't isolated. There's a pattern: microaggressions, dismissals, assumptions based on race and uniform. This precinct isn't immune." Aisha listened, every detail reinforcing a grim truth. Systemic bias was more insidious than any single officer. Dialogue with Ramirez revealed a network of small but consequential acts, officers shrugging at reports, supervisors dismissing complaints, whispers that undermine credibility, all functioning to protect the institution rather than the individuals it served. "See here," Ramirez said, pointing at a file. There were at least 3 previous complaints against Garrett, all alleging misuse of authority. None resulted in formal discipline. Patterns like this often buried quietly until they escalate. Aisha's hands tightened around the edges of the table. "So this isn't just about today. It's about decades of assumption and avoidance." "Yes," Ramirez said, "and it's subtle. Often people outside the system don't see it. Your arrest illustrates it clearly because it's public, documented, undeniable. But for many, bias is invisible until it's weaponized." The conversation shifted to procedural review. Aisha asked pointed questions. What mechanisms failed? How could bystanders be held accountable? What internal checks existed, and where did they fail? Ramirez responded candidly, detailing layers of bureaucratic inertia, official apathy, and coded language that allowed discrimination to persist without explicit evidence. Garrett's smirk from the previous day lingered in her mind. Now she understood it was bolstered by institutional protection. Policies intended to prevent abuse of authority were often circumvented through ambiguity, by design or convenience. Dialogue with Ramirez confirmed that systemic inertia was as much an ally to bias as any officer could be. Aisha requested access to body cam footage, radio logs, and witness statements. Ramirez warned her, "Expect delays. Requests can be stalled. Officers may omit details. Some may even resist cooperating. But every obstruction is data. Every hesitation is a signal." Minutes turned into hours as they mapped the internal structure, supervisors who deflected responsibility, colleagues who avoided engagement, and community liaisons who feared retaliation. Each conversation, each observation, revealed a pattern, small, coded act that cumulatively allowed prejudice to persist unchecked. Aisha's dialogue with Ramirez became strategic. Every question was a test, every answer was catalogued. She began to see the systemic shadows, networks of influence, tacit approval, and silent complicity that allowed Garrett's actions to remain unchallenged for so long. Later, Aisha requested a meeting with the witnesses from the street. 2 civilians, hesitant but cooperative, recounted the confrontation. Dialogue was careful, deliberate. Each word, each hesitation, added texture to the narrative of bias. Garrett had escalated without provocation. His laughter had been public. The assumptions had been immediate and unfiltered. Back in her barracks later that evening, Aisha reflected on the weight of what she had uncovered. It wasn't just a single officer, a single act. It was a lattice of institutional behaviors, procedural oversights, and tacit approvals. Resistance required more than confrontation. It required strategy, documentation, and relentless persistence. She reviewed her notes, ensuring that every detail, every microaggression, and every bureaucratic lapse was recorded. The fight was no longer merely personal. It was systemic. The machinery of power had to be exposed at every level, its shadows illuminated with facts and procedure. Aisha understood the stakes. Garrett's actions were a symptom, not the disease. The system's response, or lack thereof, was a true battlefield. Every delay, every half measure, every shrug of indifference became evidence of a network designed to protect privilege and maintain control. The day ended with clarity. She was not alone, but the struggle required precision. The dialogue, documentation, and strategic alliances she was cultivating would form the backbone of resistance. Bias, after all, could be weaponized, but it could also be unmasked. And Aisha Thompson, Colonel of the United States Army, was prepared to do both. The shadows of the system were vast, but she had begun to map them, one conversation, one file, one witness at a time. The reckoning would come, but it would require patience, endurance, and the unyielding assertion of truth. The weeks following the disciplinary hearing were quiet but intense. The precinct had implemented new oversight protocols. Internal Affairs monitored officer conduct more closely, and Garrett remained under strict probation. Yet the environment was subtly changed. Trust had shifted, colleagues whispered differently, and the awareness of bias had been forced into the open. Aisha Thompson returned to her Army duties, though the memory of the arrest lingered. Her uniform, once a symbol of authority assumed to intimidate, now carried the weight of resilience and proof of systemic confrontation. Dialogue with her superiors was frank and reflective. "Colonel Thompson," Captain Reynolds said, "your handling of the situation was exemplary. Not only did you assert your authority, but you also highlighted systemic issues that require attention." Aisha nodded, aware that personal triumph was intertwined with professional responsibility. "It was never about personal victory," she replied. "It's about ensuring the institution functions fairly and that prejudice doesn't go unchallenged." Even outside formal military channels, the story had made an impact. Community organizations, civil rights advocates, and social media platforms discussed the case. Dialogue highlighted broader concerns: racial profiling, misuse of authority, and the invisible barriers that perpetuate injustice. Aisha's careful documentation and public statements became references in discussions about institutional reform. Despite the progress, emotional consequences remained. Aisha reflected privately on the fear, humiliation, and tension she had endured. The arrest, confrontation, and public exposure were taxing, even for someone trained in high-pressure environments. Yet she recognized that resilience was not the absence of struggle, but the capacity to act with precision and integrity amid it. One evening, she met with Marcus Bennett to review the full case file, including the aftermath of public exposure, disciplinary records, and media coverage. "The precedent you've set," he said, "will influence future cases. Officers and institutions will think twice before acting on bias alone. Your meticulous approach demonstrates how accountability can prevail over prejudice." Aisha smiled faintly. "It shows the power of procedure, strategy, and composure. Bias thrives in chaos and ambiguity. Truth thrives in documentation and clarity." Garrett, meanwhile, faced the tangible consequences of his actions. His suspension and probation were public knowledge, his reputation in the precinct tarnished. Colleagues approached interactions with caution. The arrogance of unchecked authority diminished. Internal Affairs continued monitoring him closely, ensuring compliance with retraining programs and ethical standards. Dialogue that had once been dismissive now became measured, as accountability transformed relationships and expectations. For Aisha, the experience reshaped her understanding of power. Authority, she realized, was most effective when coupled with fairness and adherence to procedure. Misuse of power, even small microaggressions, could escalate into systemic injustice if unchecked. The case had revealed the structural vulnerabilities within institutions, how assumptions, complacency, and silence allowed bias to persist. She documented her reflections meticulously, preparing reports for both military and civilian oversight committees. Her narrative was precise, highlighting procedural lessons, the consequences of bias, and the importance of vigilance. Dialogue in these reports, though formal, captured the emotional and social stakes, translating personal experience into actionable insight. Outside the institutional sphere, Aisha received messages of support from colleagues, community members, and advocacy organizations. Their dialogue reinforced the collective impact of standing against prejudice. The story had become more than personal vindication. It was a catalyst for awareness and reform. Yet, the emotional cost remained. Aisha acknowledged moments of lingering tension, flashbacks of the arrest, and the burden of public attention. She understood that confronting systemic racism required courage not only in confrontation, but in the ongoing reflection and management of its effects. In a final reflection for the case, she wrote, Justice is rarely immediate, and accountability rarely easy. But with documentation, strategy, and unwavering adherence to truth, bias can be challenged, authority can be corrected, and systemic patterns can be exposed. Courage is measured not by absence of fear, but by precision of action in its presence. By the end of the chapter, Aisha Thompson's journey had evolved from confrontation to institutional influence, from personal struggle to public awareness. Garrett's downfall was tangible, the system's vulnerabilities illuminated, and the broader conversation on racial bias advanced. Dialogue, documentation, and deliberate action had proven more powerful than intimidation, prejudice, or assumptions. As she returned to her daily duties, Aisha carried the knowledge that resistance required persistence, patience, and composure. The story of her arrest was no longer just a singular injustice. It was a lesson, a precedent, and a call for accountability across systems. Her reflection closed with quiet resolve. The fight against bias would continue, but she had proven that authority exercised with integrity, combined with strategic action, could confront prejudice and enforce justice.